Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to the Bradbury Group, New Zealand's best weekly political argument, hosted by the militant, Marxist, anti-Santa, Martyn Bradbury. The Bradbury Group is streamed live on Rover, Sky TV, YouTube and Facebook. Proudly sponsored by Volatile, journalism you can trust. Let the arguments begin.
Kia ora Aotearoa. The true demarcation of power in a late-stage capitalism, liberal, progressive democracy is the 1% richest plus their 9% enablers versus the 90% rest of us. Welcome to the Bradbury Group Election 26, New Zealand's best weekly political argument. I'm your host, the editor of the daily blog, Martyn Bradbury. Bomber to my comrades, Mr. Bradbury if you're nasty. My pronouns are us and we. Coming up on this evening's show, the political panel all-stars tonight are former Mayor of Auckland, former leader of the Labour Party, and former High Commissioner, the very present Phil Goff, and New Zealand Herald columnist, academic and political commentator, Matthew Hooton. Tonight's 1-on-1 and 10 is the Social Policy and Parliamentary Unit Director, Dr. Bonnie Robinson, on the Salvation Army State of the Nation 2026 report. Shout out to Kiwi Skirt and Chewy from BHN moderating tonight's YouTube page. Good evening to all the Bradbury Easters online watching right now. Your comments will appear on screen as we go. Shout out to our Wātea, Facebook, Rover, Spotify, Apple Podcasts and Sky TV whānau. Remember to like and subscribe because that's all that is holding the Fourth Estate together right now. And our Twitter panel this evening is Tim Selwyn. He'll be tweeting live online at Twitter, hashtag the Bradbury Group. Before all that, however, is this week's War on News. Brothers and sisters, now, you tell me if the actual following comments by National Party MP Nancy Liu about the Prime Minister holding an umbrella was a tad much. And I quote, "This is the Christopher Luxon I know. 4 a.m. start, down at Mount Eden Park for a big announcement while people were scrambling for umbrellas. The Prime Minister grabbed one and walked straight onto the stage, holding it over the speaker mid-speech. No cameras called, no drama, just instinct. That's leadership. Kind, grounded, energetic, action-orientated. My leader, our Prime Minister. Sometimes the smallest gestures say the most." That's what she actually wrote. Now, is it just me, or is Nancy Liu hot for teacher? Does she want to marry the Prime Minister? Because I'm getting a very weird, sexually repressed North Korean Tinder vibe here. No one on the face of the planet has ever shown Chris Luxon that level of adoration ever. Not even on his honeymoon. I'm pretty sure if you ask all the people smashed by the recent extreme weather events how good Luxon is at providing shelter, I think you get a very different answer. I think Nancy Liu needs a cold shower, a cup of tea, and a lie down. Talking of cold showers and a cup of tea and a lie down, David Seymour launched his State of the Nation by promising to do a Thanos on the public sector and finger click half the state away. He wants to go Musk Doge on the New Zealand state with an Argentinian chainsaw to purify New Zealand as a free market utopia where supply and demand is the only morality. Like The Handmaid's Tale, but privatised. The political hypocrisy of demanding small government with a microscopic G, slash and burn, while he sets up the most expensive red tape ministry would be laughable if it weren't so septic. When it's Seymour's vanity project, he can't stop spending money. When it's everyone else, they can go screw themselves. How on brand for libertarians. And finally this week, ladies and gentlemen, as extreme storm after extreme storm after extreme storm relentlessly slams into New Zealand, maybe it's time to ask, gosh, that seems a tad extreme. What's all that about then? It's almost like something is changing the climate in a very detrimental way that is causing a great disturbance in the force. When asked about the weather this week, Emergency Management and Recovery Minister Mark Mitchell said, and I quote, "It's just weather. Weather changes. Whatever the environmental problem, National's response is always, more cows! In the words of the great warrior poet Mike Hosking, happy days. The political panel all-stars up shortly, Whānau. But first, this week's one-on-one in 10 with Salvation Army Social Policy and Parliamentary Unit Director, Dr. Bonnie Robinson. Kia ora, comrade. Welcome to the show, and thank you for being available to the Fourth Estate. Your democracy is grateful.
Kia ora, and thanks for having me.
Dr. Robinson, you are the Salvation Army Social Policy and Parliamentary Unit Director. The Salvation Army State of the Nation report has just been released, and the stats are damning. 43,500 people estimated to be in severe housing deprivation, 400 less transitional housing placements, and allocated funding for housing support cut by $80 million. 156,000 plus children living in material hardship. Salvation Army food parcel distribution increased 7% to 90,250 parcels last year. Pacific unemployment was at 12.3% and Māori unemployment at twice that of the general population. And domestic violence numbers are surging. If you talk to many frontline community groups, they will cast deep doubt about the veracity of those official numbers and argue that things could actually be far worse than the grim stats in your report. As bad as things are, the reality, is it not, is that the levels of social damage, inequality and poverty could be worse than what these are showing, couldn't they, Dr. Robinson?
Well, we can only go on the stats that we can get. So one of the reasons we put the report together is we try and mine the publicly available stats that are put out by government and pull those together and go, what is this telling us? These things are available to anyone to look at, but many people don't have the time or the skill to put them together. So what we offer is a kind of a condensed version, and also it's a time series. So we're able to look at the trends over time, which I think are really important, because we do get blips up and down. But when we see a trend over time, particularly over several years, then we can start to say this is a real issue that needs to be dealt with. As to whether there's under or over counting, it's hard for us to know. Sometimes our frontline staff will say, hey, we think it's a lot worse. Sometimes they say, hey, in our area, things seem to be okay with that. But these are the stats we have, and so we work with those. And even with taking them, it is a reasonably grim picture. Most things, half of the things we look at, half of the measures we look at have got worse in the last year. Some have stayed the same, but putting that in perspective, some of those were pretty bad already, so they just haven't got any worse. It's not that they've got better. A few things have got better, which is great, and shows that things can improve if we have the right kind of approach and policies. But overall, in terms of our social well-being, things are not looking good, particularly for the people that we see at our Salvation Army centres, which tend to be those on the lowest incomes, those on benefits, and those who are very vulnerable.
How do you marry up the political rhetoric that we hear about poverty with the reality of poverty? How far a disconnect is there?
Well, I think that, people who don't work in social services may not understand what it looks like. It looks like a mum who says that every day she's completely obsessed with how she's going to get enough food to put a meal on the table, and who therefore doesn't have any energy or time to put into maybe dealing with other things that are happening in her life, or trying to get some training or something that might move her forward. It looks like children who are not secure about whether they will have a meal tonight.
Right.
Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. It looks like children that don't get sent to school at the start of the year because mum and dad can't afford the uniform until they get paid at the end of next week.
Right.
And they're too embarrassed to admit that and ask for help. So they just choose not to send the kid to school for a couple of weeks.
No.
Not that they don't value education, but they're ashamed to ask for that assistance. It's really practical, everyday things. And I think if you don't work in that sector, you might not realise what that looks like. I remember someone saying they talked to someone who said, why do people need to go to food banks? And they said to them, well, when you're hungry, what do you do? And they said, oh, well, I go to the fridge, and if it's empty, I'd go to the supermarket, or I order an Uber Eats. And this person said, well, what if none of that was available to you? what would you do then?
Yeah.
So I think, one of the reasons we put this report out, and this year we've got a few stories as well in the report, is to try and say to people, this is the reality, and behind those statistics, those are actual people living this life. Yeah.
If we look at some of the draconian welfare sanctions rolled out by this government, including the needlessly cruel elimination of a tax credit for solo parents with borders, to the punishment of having your welfare put on a card or monitored spending, which traps beneficiaries in a grey zone of perpetual surveillance, why are we so focused on the stick and no carrot for those on welfare?
It is puzzling because there's a lot of research that suggests that the majority of people who are needing benefits or financial assistance are actually doing their absolute best.
Right.
But they are they're in very complex situations sometimes, or they just can't meet the requirements. I mean, if you don't have any credit on your phone, how do you get in contact? And there's a lot of evidence that wraparound support, supportive programs, things that actually encourage and keep the mana of people have better outcomes, even where people may have made some poor personal choices. But one of the things that we like to talk about is the fact that whatever the merits of their parents, children don't get to choose.
Exactly.
They are born into the family they're born into.
Exactly.
They don't get to choose who their parents are. They don't get to choose their socio-economic circumstances, but they will be significantly impacted by them. So that when things are difficult or made more difficult for parents, or for adults, then you are inevitably making them difficult for children.
Exactly.
And we know from the research that any significant time spent in poverty or material hardship as a child can mar your life for the rest of your life. Even if your trajectory gets better, that impact is like a trauma that stays with you. So the longer we leave people in poverty, the longer we leave children in poverty, we're going to see that down the track, and it will cost us down the track. So we either spend the money now helping our children, or we spend it later fixing things with adults.
The government was warned on numerous occasions that changing the definitions of who could get emergency housing would result in a tsunami of homelessness, which is exactly what happened. And the government's response to creating more homelessness is that we will simply arrest the homeless. Shouldn't voters be confronted by the poverty caused by the government they've elected into power? Don't we have an actual moral obligation to see it so that we can't just pretend it's not there?
Well, I think one of the things is, particularly with homelessness, is some of it is easy to see, but some of it's hard to see. So people who sleep rough, we see them, and and that's in the newspapers, and there's all sorts of debates about what do we do about it. But most homelessness is actually not people sleeping rough, although that has doubled in Auckland in the last 12 months. Most homelessness is seen in insecure housing, moving frequently, couch surfing, families sharing housing and it being overcrowded, children having to move school often because they're moving house often. So the homelessness that is significantly impacting families is often hidden. We also, I think, see the housing issue in the number of amount of food support we have to give. So, people pay the rent because otherwise, you're homeless.
Right.
But then if they're paying 30-40% of their income on rent, if it's a low income particularly, there's not enough left often for the other bills. And so people tend to pay their rent, pay the power bill, and then if they're short of money for food. And so we see them coming for food. And then when our staff talk to people, they kind of peel the onion. It's often the cost of housing that is the problem. Now, rents have dropped a little, but we have to remember they were very high, particularly for those on low incomes who were in the private rental market. So things have improved a little bit. But if you're on a low income, if you're on the minimum wage, and you're in the private rental market, it's still pretty tough. You're still spending a lot of your income on rent, and then you've got to try and meet all your other costs.
In a political media landscape driven by social media hate algorithms, we have an all-tribe, no-village culture now. For those asking, why should we care about the poverty of others? That it's a parent's responsibility to feed their kids, that they aren't trying hard enough. What would you say to those people?
I think we love to do a dichotomy, don't we? We like to do an either or, and it's not that simple. Life is complex. And so people's situations are usually a complex mix of personal circumstances and socioeconomic circumstances.
Sure.
It's not an either or. So that's one thing for people to think about is that it's not just personal choice. It's not just socioeconomic. It's usually a combo of that. But there are a lot of barriers that people face to trying to get out of poverty. There's poverty traps that are really hard for people to get out of. And, particularly when people have got children, to sacrifice $20 is quite significant if you're on a really low income. And I think there's also been quite a lot of research down through the years that the more unequal a society is, the less healthy it is for everybody. It's not just, obviously, those who are on low incomes often take the biggest, have the hardest road. But actually, there's research that suggests the more unequal we are, the less healthy we are, everyone. So we should be concerned about that. But I also come back to, our major concern with children. If we don't support families with children and take them out of poverty and material hardship, then you will pay for that down the track. You'll see it in our health system. You'll see it in our criminal justice system. So wouldn't we rather invest in our children and make sure that they can flourish and they can become the people that, they're intended to be, rather than kind of clean up the problems down the track?
Part of the agenda of the right is to strangle off revenue so the government can't afford a fully funded welfare state. ACTA calling for a smaller government. National believes stepping away lets the market step in and do it cheaply. And New Zealand first think vaccines are globalisation. What are you hearing this election when the poor are being discussed, and are their rights being considered?
I think the key thing we want to do is make sure that the voice of those who are on low incomes, who are vulnerable, do get heard, because often they're not. They get talked about, not talked with.
Yes.
And people, do kind of judge from their own framework of thinking and their own experience. And so one of the things we try to do in a lot of our work in the social policy unit is to kind of give a voice for people who may not otherwise have it in that political world. What people then do with that, we are not in control of that, but we can at least try and say, here's the data and here's the stories of real people that sit behind the data, and what are we going to do to change this situation? And I think there needs to be, what we'll be looking for, I think, is what is the urgent action that people can commit to, because particularly in the child poverty data, but in a lot of the negative data, it's been sitting there for a while. This isn't new. There's nothing in the stats that we've done in the State of the Nation that should surprise people, because it's been there for a while. So where is the urgency? Where is the things that we can do now? Because children can't wait.
Sure.
They can't wait for the economy to boom. They can't wait for, to get out of recession. They're being affected right now. And a year in a child's life is a really long time.
Yes.
So what is the urgent action that people can offer?
Our prison population has spiked when economic anxiety is high, law and order debates become very shrill. Looking at the stats, all our underfunded prison system seems to be good at doing is taking broken men and making them more damaged. What do you think we're getting wrong about justice in New Zealand society?
Well, we know that when you have a focus on reintegration, and particularly reintegration in the community, wraparound support for the complex issues that generally drive people into prison, then we get better outcomes with people. So we really need to focus on reintegration. And I think the other big issue that we see is that our prisons were designed for about 15% of people to be on remand, so waiting trial or waiting sentence. It's currently at about 40%, and our prison system just isn't designed for that. So, we need to have a look at who are we putting in prison and why, and is that actually the best option? I mean, obviously we've got community safety, but the safe, to make something safe, the best thing is to have people not re-offend. And reintegration programs, wraparound support, dealing with drug and alcohol, dealing with mental health, those things will make us safer.
Finally, Dr. Robinson, is there a better way when it comes to welfare policy in a country that once had high egalitarian principles?
I think if we look at the data and take that seriously and go, how do we actually really start turning this around? What are the various options and mechanisms that we've got that we can use to turn that around? There's plenty of research out there. There's plenty of, data. What we need to do is take that and go, what are we going to do urgently to start turning some of these things around? And also, what do we need to actually commit to for the long term? Because some things are going to take a while.
Yeah.
Some things we can turn around quickly, but some things just take a long-term commitment of resources so that, over the medium and long term, we will start to see things, but it won't happen in a 1 year or 3 year cycle.
Thank you, comrade. Thank you for the amazing work you do. Thank you for appearing this evening.
Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks.
Kia ora. Okay, now to our political panel all-stars. Our first panellist is the union rep for Slytherin House. He makes Machiavelli look like a virgin, and he's the only New Zealand right-winger not on the Taxpayers Union payroll. Perpetually joining us from a secure, undisclosed location for reasons we can't disclose. New Zealand Herald columnist Matthew Hooton. Kia ora, comrade. Welcome to the show. One word to describe the week, please, sir.
Impressed.
Why?
Well, I was very impressed with that interview just then that you did. Certainly compared with last week's effort. I thought that was an outstanding. Congratulations to the Salvation Army for doing a data-based approach.
Yes.
And then talking completely rationally and reasonably about the data in an interview.
You felt the co-leader of the Māori Party didn't do that last week?
Not quite to the same extent as Dr. Robinson. And, we need much more of that type of thing. I was surprised she said some of the measures have improved in the last year. I would have thought everything would have got worse because of the deep recession that we experienced through 2025. I mean, have a bad recession, social indicators go bad. So it was good. Some things have apparently improved. And, I look across the political spectrum. I think Dr. Robinson from the Salvation Army and Dr. Oliver Hartwich from the New Zealand Initiative might be the only two people who are prepared to actually do some research, write a report, and talk rationally about it rather than doing social media memes.
And also on tonight's show, he's a former Auckland mayor, a former leader of the Labour Party, and a former High Commissioner to the UK, the ever-present Phil Goff. Kia ora, comrade. Welcome to the show. One word to describe the week, please, sir.
Oh, I'm just going to follow on from what Matthew said and comment on that interview with Bonnie Robinson, which I thought was really good. I did something interesting this week. I went to a site in my old electorate of Mount Roskill. It's 580 Hillsborough Road. Used to be it was a Kia ora site. It had 80 pensioner units in it. It's now been demolished. And, okay, they needed to demolish it. It had some construction difficulties when it was built 30 years ago. But now they're going to, the local MP is talking about turning it into a truck park. And I was just thinking, I'm okay in retirement because I've made savings, I've paid off my mortgage, etc. But there's an increasing number of elderly New Zealanders that go from the workplace where they were working hard but getting low wages. They could never afford their own home. They just got by on their wage, and then they retire and their wage drops, but their rent doesn't.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, what we need more than ever is to make provision for people in their twilight years so that they're not forced below the poverty line.
Yeah.
And this block of, and it was a beautiful community, had a men's workshop, it had a social room in it, a real sense of community. They were good neighbours to the wider community. And they're not going to replace it. They're going to turn it into a truck shop park. well, where are the values? Where are the priorities? And what are we doing about the fact that there are more and more people going into retirement that have never had the chance to save and to buy their own home? So, what Bonnie Robinson was saying about housing, it's a real difficulty, but it just struck home to me that this particular category of people, when you're over 65, you're not able to go out into the workforce and make your way in the world or do anything. You basically live on what you've got and you don't have any options. So I think we do need a change in approach, and we need to take into account that people in the last years of their life shouldn't be forced into a situation of living below the poverty line and having miserable last years of their life in retirement.
Preach, can't we get this man a job somewhere? Can't we get this person back into politics? Brothers and sisters, let's get into tonight's show. Issue 1, is Winston's new Māori electorates referendum another treaty principles referendum political nightmare for Chris Luxon plus the latest polls? Issue 2, why is the government going ahead with a gas scam? Issue 3, India free trade deal and rising anti-immigrant sentiment. And issue 4 tonight, if America and Israel do attack Iran, what should New Zealand do? Plus, we'll have a final word at the end of the show. Each panelist gets to go to the mountaintop to see who breaches broadcasting standards this week. Our money, as always, is on Hooton. Comrades, let's get into issue 1. And that's the announcement by Mātua Winston to do a David Seymour and launch a race-baiting attack on Māori political aspiration with a referendum on the Māori electorates, which will be as corrosive as ACT's treaty principles referendum. Phil, Mātua Winston justifies removing the Māori electorates by claiming fewer people are on the roll now and that more are on the general roll. Both of these things are not true. 16,000 more Māori are on the Māori roll since the last election, and the majority of Māori are on the Māori roll. How good faith is this referendum when the reasons he's giving are just completely false?
Well, everybody knows what the reason is. It's another dog whistle. It's the populist line. This is a bit rich coming from the guy who, when he first stood for Parliament, 1975, he stood in Northern Maori against Matt Rata. And then, of course, I remember 1996 when New Zealand first won all of the Maori seats. I didn't hear a word of complaint about the Maori seats in those days.
Funny, eh?
Yeah. But look, this is not the first time this has been promised. It's promised by people who want to scratch a particular itch in the community. John Key promised it in 2008. Did he ever deliver on it? No. And why didn't he deliver on it? Well, first reason, he was in coalition with the Māori Party.
Yep.
And that was never going to happen. But second, he said, I've come to the conclusion that it'd be too divisive. Now, we've had Māori seats for 150 years. Does it give them a special privilege? No, because one person, one vote applies whether you're on the Māori roll or not. The number of Māori seats is determined by the number of people who decide to go on the Māori roll. It's not on a blood percentage. It's how you identify. So, I mean, I could go on the Māori roll if I wanted to. So why would you do that when you know that you're not going to deliver on it because all hell would break loose? It will be seen as a fundamental breach of Māori as a treaty partner. Is there any advantage to doing it? No. Is there a disadvantage? There's a huge one. So what we're seeing is, I know I'll never do this, but I'll promise it, and I'll appeal to that prejudice again that he's appealed to many times over, which is a prejudice against his own people, and because he is Maori by descent. Unbelievable. Well, not unbelievable. Totally predictable, because that's what populists do.
Follow-up question. Mātua Winston is saying Te Pāti Māori's behaviour has been so bad that the electorates should go. But even if we accept his argument that their MPs have been disruptive or disrespectful, that in no way justifies removing the electorates. Shouldn't Māori decide when and if they want to dump those electorates? And wouldn't tipping all those Māori into general electorates turn a whole lot of safe national seats to Labour?
Well, who knows what would happen on it. But, to say I don't like Te Pāti Māori, there's a lot of things Te Pāti Māori have done that I don't agree with. And they've created, they've almost gone into self-destruction. Yes. But that is a totally different issue from whether or not you have Māori seats.
Exactly.
There's not a connection between the two things. You know, I could say that the Tight Five under Winston Peters' New Zealand First Party, you know, they did a lot of things that I didn't like either, but that was not a reason for me to call for the abolition of the Māori seats.
Bingo.
Because somebody else was winning them.
Exactly.
You know, he wants to be the kingmaker. That's the role that Winston plays, and he's worried that if the Māori Party actually survive and tip the balance, they'll be the kingmaker and not him.
Matthew Winston proclaims he is standing for democracy, but he's really standing for majoritarianism, which is two wolves and a lamb voting who to eat for lunch. Should the majority decide the rights of the minority?
Well, you know, 50% plus one is part of what democracy is, but it really doesn't apply to constitutional and electoral issues, and it doesn't apply to, you know, fundamental rights, which this arguably falls into. I mean, if 50% plus one voted to say that Martyn Bradbury couldn't vote anymore, I mean, I think I'd wholeheartedly support that. I think that would be excellent, good policy. But there is a problem with that, isn't there?
Right.
And in the end, when it comes to the right to vote, it can't be removed, and that can be extended to other parts of the Constitution. I don't think this is going to happen. Christopher Luxon has learned his lesson well with the pre-treaty principles bill fiasco. He has grown on these issues as to some extent, as you would hope from being Prime Minister. One thing, though, I was thinking about is we mustn't assume that the referendum would go a certain way. Now, the question of Māori wards was put to local body voters last year, and as Phil knows, being a former mayor, people who vote in local body politicians are on average older and more conservative than the average in general elections for central government. Yet, when it was put to the voters there, it's true that 24 out of 18 of the local areas decided to remove the Māori wards, but the overall vote of the 1,010,000 people who voted, which is pretty good poll size, of leaning conservative voters was 46% in favour of keeping the Māori wards. Yeah. Now, if that was duplicated in a national referendum on the future of the Māori seats, it would entrench them for another 150 years, I would have thought. So I wonder if at a certain point, maybe the Labour Māori caucus, some people in the Māori Party, the Greens, even some people in National who very strongly support the Māori seats might say, well, isn't it time to call the bluff of the people who keep calling this for this referendum? Why do we assume it would go in a certain way? Hobson's Pledge, the radical activist group on these issues, it was very disappointed with the result in the local body poll, and I am not sure that it wouldn't be even more disappointed if this were put to the vote. But I do think, as a matter of principle, it's something that should be driven by Māori voters. But maybe it's time to call people's bluff.
Quick round TVNZ poll last night has National on 34%, Labour 32%, Greens 11%, New Zealand First 10%, ACT 9%, Te Pāti Māori 2%, Don't Knows a huge 11%. Winston's appeal to the worst angels of our nature is going to determine the selection, isn't it, Phil Goff?
Yeah, he seems to be in the position of being the kingmaker once again. And that was, I would support MMP over first past the post if a referendum came up. But it does put disproportionate power in the hands of, in this case, one person, because New Zealand First is effectively Winston Peters. Yeah. There's no other voice that contradicts Winston Peters. So, my guess is that his ploy will be to say to National or to Labour, make me Prime Minister for half of this term, and I will throw my support behind you and make you government. Very self-serving. The same Winston Peters who, in 2005 said, "I don't want the baubles of office," and then as soon as he
Give me those baubles! Give me those baubles!
he said, "I'm going to be foreign minister." I've never done it before, but that's the job I want. Look, that's the downside of the system that we've got. And on the podcast I do with Chris Finlayson, Chris made a decent point. He said, if you're left of centre, vote for Labour. If you're right of centre, vote for National. But don't put power in the hands of a smaller group that then is the tail, or in this case of the present government, the two tails wagging the dog. Yeah. I think, both Seymour and Peters are partly responsible for the plight that Luxon finds himself in. Yep. Because he looks weak as they use their potential power to stop things happening, and they're more experienced politicians than he is. Yeah.
Matthew, are we going to see National or Labour giving Winston Prime Ministership as his price?
Well, they'll all say no, and I think genuinely they would believe that they would always say no to that. But, it surprised everybody. It surprised people when Winston Peters asked to be treasurer in 1996. It only Jim Bolger had the foresight to understand it wouldn't really matter one way or the other if he was treasurer, and so against the opposition of his caucus, Jim Bolger said, "Look, we'll agree to that," and secured a third term. And then I think Phil was a little unfair on Winston Peters on the foreign minister question. He had represented New Zealand as deputy prime minister at the Hong Kong handover, and he is an accomplished diplomat when he's abroad, and he does have an interest in foreign policy. So something he asked for. It's not uncommon in coalitions abroad for another party to hold that. I think he does intend to seek the prime ministership. For that to be credible, you'll need to see National and Labour, falling to 25% of the polls, which is possible, and you'll need the New Zealand First Party up to 15 or higher. So it just becomes plausible. If it's if it's 10% for New Zealand First, 10% for ACT, and 30% for National, or the other way with Labour and the Greens, it wouldn't be plausible. But, as we've seen in the United Kingdom, as we see in Australia, as we certainly have seen in the United States, it's not impossible that the two establishment parties see a collapse in their vote and cede power to populists.
Comrades, we need to move on to issue 2 tonight, and that is, why is this government going ahead with a $2.7 billion gas scam that will produce more climate change emissions while charging us all a tax? Matthew, you wrote a scathing article in the New Zealand Herald questioning if we've been sold some magic beans by the gas industry, who seem to be the only ones benefiting from this plant. What is National thinking here?
Well, these are very, very complex decisions, right, all around the world where they're made. The energy sector is incredibly difficult because it has all these peaks and you've got to match. You can't store electricity, so you've got to match. It's one of the few industries where you've got to match supply and demand pretty much, identically every second of the day. It's not quite that strict, but compared with any other industry, that's a feature of the electricity industry that makes it different. So the people who make decisions in the electricity industry around the world and who reliably get them right, they're very rare people. And quite frankly, if people do have that sort of knowledge and insight to make those decisions, they do become billionaires. I mean, if they can reliably make these decisions. So I just find it difficult to believe that the New Zealand government and MV officials, really and truly, and Simon Watts are likely to have made the right decision. And that's not to say there's anybody in New Zealand who might make a better one, but it is to underline that it is a difficult decision, and these people are highly susceptible to people who can present well, have the right economic reports, wear the right suits, have the right PowerPoint slides, and can make a case that sounds very, very compelling, But in this case, it does seem to serve the interests of the Australian gas industry primarily. I don't think it'll raise carbon emissions. I think it is better than burning coal, but I'm just not sure it's the right economic decision.
Follow-up question. Follow-up question. Households don't use LNG. Industry uses LNG, specifically Fonterra in winter to dry out milk powder. That takes huge amounts of power from the grid, which is why there's a general energy shortage in August. Isn't this just naked corporate welfare that we're all paying for?
Well, someone will benefit from this project.
Somewhat, not us.
in a way that I don't think, to be fair to it, the government knows about. Right. I don't think this is a situation where the government is trying to favour a particular company, or I think that government is genuinely trying to do the right thing, but it is obviously overspec. The argument that's made against renewables, I don't think really works. We do actually in New Zealand have batteries, and they are the lake levels.
That's right.
So while it's true that you can't run solar in night and you can't do wind when it's not blowing, if you're using more solar, more wind, more nuclear, or any of those clean and green energies in New Zealand, then the lakes won't be used as much, and the battery, so-called battery of those lakes, will last longer. So I despair that New Zealand's going down this path. It won't cost $1 billion. It'll cost at least that. Ask Phil about the Auckland City Rail link. It'll take twice as long. It won't be open in 2008 if it proceeds.
Phil, the government plans to rush through as many of the required approvals as possible ahead of the election under urgency. They are bypassing the fast-track powers they created. Is that lack of scrutiny bad policy making for something as significant as this?
Well, I heard Chris Bishop make a point that I agreed with, which is when you're talking about infrastructure that's going to be there for a long time and you spend a lot of money on, try to do it to the extent that you are able in our political system in a bipartisan way. Sure. And yet the way in which this has gone ahead actually is the opposite of what Chris Bishop was saying should happen.
Right.
I think they've made two mistakes. The first mistake was to deny that this was I heard Simon Watts say it's not a levy. And I thought, that's funny. The handout that came from his office said it was a levy. And a levy, as Winston Peters appropriately pointed out, the levy is a tax. Just call it what it is.
Yeah.
Now, I wouldn't mind the levy or the tax if it was for the right thing. But I'm actually with Matthew on this. I don't think that the wisdom rests with MB. They did an earlier report by some consultants which said exactly the opposite. So, it's was it Frontier or some such group? But it seems to me that the one thing we know in the world today is that there are two things that are rapidly coming down in cost and improving in efficiency. One is solar panels and two is batteries.
Yeah.
Now, Matthew's right. The huge battery, because 70% of our electricity comes from hydro, is in the lakes level. Now, this is to prepare for a dry year. But a dry year is also, by definition, a sunny year.
Yeah.
So if you were to spend that money instead in helping people install solar panels on their residence, which means you don't have to transmit the power down the power lines and lose a percentage of the energy in doing that. And if people had the batteries that they can store it on, or we'll get to the point where we can actually store electricity in big batteries anyway. Yes. The battery technology has just moved ahead tremendously. I would take some convincing that relying on LNG, for which is one of the most expensive fuels, whereas sunlight is one of the cheapest, instinctively I would think I need some real persuasion to say that that's what we need to do. The more that you can put in solar batteries and the more that you reduce people's reliance on the grid, the more self-sufficient we're going to be.
And more resilient, right? More resilient.
And obviously solar is the ultimate in clean energy.
Yeah.
So I really doubt whether that decision is a well-founded decision. And I think rushing it through so that might be a fait accompli because you've started it before the end of the year is a foolish thing to do.
Matthew, you want to jump in there?
Well, I don't think they're saying we'll rely on LNG. It's more that this is meant to be, they're saying anyway, that it's just at the margins. And it might be every 3 or 4 years that some of this LNG comes in. But you see, they're building a plant as if it was what Phil is saying, that it's to become part of the permanent source of energy.
Right.
So that just doesn't work. And I think the other thing, the infrastructure commission that the government has set up, and Chris Bishop has done excellent work on this. One of the things it came out and said in its report today is when politicians rush things, that's when the cost goes up.
Yeah.
So look, if this is a good idea, because it's such a difficult decision, and everyone acknowledges that, and as I said, if you reliably can make these decisions accurately, you deserve to be a billionaire, and you will be a billionaire. I mean, you would think you'd have select committee hearings, wouldn't you?
Right.
You'd think that you'd at least have a fast track process.
Right. But
the idea that the Parliament of New Zealand, for which I have very little regard, is going to make this decision all on its own, just is absurd. And the Infrastructure Commission is right. We shouldn't speed things up for political timetables because that costs the taxpayer, and we haven't got any money to waste.
Comrades, we need to move on to issue 3 tonight, and that is the India free trade deal and rising anti-immigrant sentiment. Phil, you are a free trade cheerleader from way back, but domestic workers fear their jobs are being undercut by exploited migrant labour. Chippy has said he wants more labour inspectorates and safeguards against migrant worker exploitation before Labour votes for this. How important is it to get a free trade deal that doesn't alienate your domestic working class? Because we've seen that alienation in America, Australia and Britain.
Yeah, well, all of those arguments were used against the free trade agreement that I was in charge of, which was the free trade agreement with China. And one Winston Peters opposed it and voted against it.
That's right.
Our trade increased 10% with China.
Right.
And it moved from being in China's favour to in New Zealand's favour.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever heard Winston apologise for getting that wrong. What he's doing is that he's doing the thing that he's done for decades, which is find a scapegoat, immigrants.
Right.
Immigrants have been used by the populist movement across the whole of the world time and time again. Look, I'm in favour of this free trade agreement. I don't think it's a gold standard one. It excludes 30% of our exports by definition because it excludes dairy. It leaves tariffs in place and it leaves non-tariff barriers in place. And it has this crazy thing where the government has undertaken to invest $33 billion in India over the next 15 years. And if we don't do that, and the government can't do that because it doesn't, it's up to the private sector.
It's broke.
It's broke.
And it's broke. If they don't do that, then India can renege on its undertakings on goods. Now, that's what I see the real weakness.
Yep.
Immigration, frankly, is just a red herring.
Right.
1,667, employment, temporary employment entry visas for green list areas where we have a skill shortage. We're not talking about people that are coming in that are displacing New Zealand workers by and large. These are people that are going into skill shortage areas. That's what the green list is about. So it's just a nonsense. I mean, I remember Winston, when I was Minister of Justice, attacking me because Indian immigrants were Asian immigrants, I'm sorry, he didn't limit it to Indian. Asian immigrants were causing crime.
Yes.
I pointed out to him that the crime rate amongst the Asian population on a per capita basis was half of that of the rest of the indigenous New Zealand population. Yes. But he'd still use it. He was the one that came up with the Asian invasion.
That's right.
Now, this was going to change our way of life. This is just a dog whistle. And if you look at the speech that he gave last year to the New Zealand First Conference, he talked about people who didn't salute the flag, who didn't pay respects to those that had gone before them and tried to impose their religion on others. In other words, saying immigrants are unpatriotic, they're ungrateful, and they're religious extremists.
Yeah.
So why do you keep calling it Why do you keep calling it dog whistling? I don't see that there's any dog
It's
whistling.
a canine horn at this point.
I mean, I think that's a sort of, it's quite explicit what's being said on both sides of this debate, and that's to be welcomed because it isn't dog whistling. And there are genuine debates to be had here, and if they're not had sensibly, including about immigration, then the danger is that you do end up with your Donald Trump or your Farage or your Pauline Hanson. And so I think it needs to be acknowledged there is an issue around immigration into New Zealand, including where it comes from. Does it come from countries that are richer than us or poorer than us? There is a debate to be had. And unfortunately, I think because of the way Winston Peters launched the immigration debate in Howick at a particular time in the early 90s and talked about McMansions, I think everybody has been too afraid to debate this seriously for fear of being racist, partly because there are many racist people involved in the debate, but that's not to say we can hide from it.
Matthew, you have argued that the Prime Minister has done a poor job of selling the India trade deal, which is surprising because Christopher Luxon is a dazzling CEO, great deal maker, whose charm, warmth and wit imbues all who meet him with joyful optimism. Just ask Nancy Liu. What do you think the Prime Minister needs to do?
Well, when it comes to advising this government, it's all a bit late. Right? I would have managed things differently 2.5 years ago, on tax, on this issue. He does need to take Chris Hipkins altogether more seriously. Chris Hipkins wrote a very well-reasoned, very fair enough, almost statesmanlike letter to the Prime Minister, making some completely valid points from the perspective of someone on the political left. And also, for wherever you sit, I mean, of course, an opposition can't be expected to support something if they don't see the unredacted advice. So I think Hipkins has done that, and they haven't taken it seriously. But it goes back, Phil took credit for the China deal. Fair enough, he signed it, and he was there when it was put together. But that was put together over more than a decade by National and Labour governments. Started with the four firsts back in about 97 was the first of them, and as I said last week, I worked for Trade Minister Lockwood Smith during that time when the relationship with China was being developed, and he made sure absolutely to be in close contact at all times with Mike Moore, the Labour trade spokesperson. I know that Jim Sutton, who was then the Trade Minister, I think, for the following 6 years from 99 to 2005, he made sure that the Labour Party kept the national people deeply involved in his trade policy. I'm not sure how Phil.
Oh, I absolutely did that. I took Tim Grocer with me to things like the WTO because trade, by definition, a bit like infrastructure, is something that should go above
politics,
party politics, and you work together for the good of your country.
But we're not seeing it, are we?
But I will take issue. I will take issue with one thing, that this is not about racism. Winston Peters knows exactly what he's doing. And you mentioned Mike Moore before. And Mike Moore, I remember saying to me, and he was quite close to Winston, he said, the trouble is Winston doesn't believe this rubbish that he's talking, but the people that he's appealing to do,
Bingo.
and they act on it.
Yeah.
And that makes what he is doing, in my mind, despicable would be a good word for it. Look, you have to have a sensible debate on immigration, but 1,667 people into skill shortage areas.
Right.
Does anybody really think that is going to change the way of life in New Zealand? Well, it might for the better. You go to a hospital, it's not full of Asian patients, it's full of Asian doctors and nurses.
Although that's not the issue that's being challenged so much. That 1,667 is not really.
Well, what is he challenging?
Issue. Well, I think there is a genuine issue around obviously investment aspect that you mentioned. I mean, on a trade and investment, 100% of the New Zealand market for 70% of the Indian market, it's a no-brainer. Anyone would do that deal in a second. And the investment procedures are quite good. So it's really, I think, that the two things are whether this $30 billion thing is real. The Indian government says it is. The New Zealand government says it's not. Well, we'll have to see the text. But I think the 5,000, the complete removal of numbers of students. Now, the government does say, oh, well, there's not a cap on students at all. All this does is say we couldn't put a cap on Indian students, although, there's differences of statements about what's the truth. But it does allow also the other parts of it, allows the Indian private sector to invest in the New Zealand education system, build schools, build polytechs, English language schools, universities. It does give them more right to do that. And if then the number of Indians coming to New Zealand to study here genuinely is not allowed to be capped, and you can bring your partner and your children, then I can see there is an issue that needs to be answered there. I think it's true that New Zealand is already overexposed in our tertiary institutions to overseas students. We've become too reliant on them. And I think it's perfectly acceptable to have a discussion about whether it's desirable
Comrades,
to remove that.
Comrades, we need to wrap the show with a final word. We've run out of time. Phil, your final word this week, please, sir.
Oh, well, we didn't get onto the last topic.
No, sorry, we just ran
So maybe
out.
my final word will be on that.
On Trump and Iran. Is it going to happen?
It's possible. I think they'll try to avoid it. Their attack, their bombing of the nuclear facilities in Iran didn't do the damage that they hoped it did.
Yes.
But look, I believe in the rule of international law, because if you don't have that, you simply have the rule of power. And, you can, under the UN Charter principles that the United States helped set up and was a major force in, but it has to be for self-defence, and there must be an imminent threat, and you can't do a preemptive strike,
right,
or it has to be through a Security Council resolution. So an attack on... I detest the Iran government.
Of course.
They're awful people. They abuse human rights.
Absolutely.
And they're illegitimate because most Iranian people don't want them there. But no country has the right to go in and impose itself on another country.
Right.
And Trump wouldn't be doing it for the reasons of the oppression and the abuse of human rights. He'd be doing it because it suits his purpose that might make the United States safer. So, look, I believe that you can't be selective on the law. It applies to everybody. Everybody should be under it, and that's the only way that you get a safe, secure and stable international community.
Preach. Matthew, your final word this week, please, sir.
We're going to find something out very interesting tomorrow. We're going to find out who's going to win the election. We may not need the Bradbury Group for the rest of the year, because tomorrow the Reserve Bank and the new governor announces her first official cash rate review. The market believes that the official cash rate will be increased before the election in September. And if the new governor, who's a very orthodox economist, an excellent economist, and she's read the New Zealand law, she's read the agreement she has with the minister, so she is an inflation ultra, which is what the government wants. If she basically falls in line with what the market is pricing, then she will be indicating there will be interest rate rises before the election. And I think that would be very, very damaging to the government's chances of re-election. Of course, if she doesn't agree with the market and she indicates that the first rises won't be until after the election, or maybe even next year, then I think the government will be very happy. But we'll all get to find out tomorrow.
Thank you, comrades. And now to my final word, brothers and sisters. Thank Jesus David Seymour has stripped the Māori name out of the healthy school lunches. His bastardisation of the school lunch program that created so many local jobs and fed healthy kai into the cheap corporate slop it has become does not deserve te reo. And let's be clear, the true cost of taking a $8 lunch and reducing it to $3 wasn't the supposed cash saved. It was the thousands of local jobs and nutritional degradation. Seymour's school lunches have only 13% of the 30% nutritional daily requirements. We pay $2.74 to feed prisoners each meal. Seymour is giving our kids 26 cents more and calling that charity. Don't give me that it's the parents' responsibility to feed their kids crap. If you are a man who seriously has a problem with ensuring our kids get a healthy feed at school, hand in your man card now, because you aren't a man, you are a bully that likes to bully kids. Hungry children don't learn. We feed them, we feed us all. I am sick to death of government programs brownwashing themselves with a Māori name while implementing policies that are brutal to Māori. I say take back these Māori names. Demand them to be stripped because they have not earned the mana of the Māori language. Oranga Tamariki damages Māori children. Demand the name back. Kianga Ora has shut down their public house building obligations while homelessness explodes. Demand the name back. Turn Seymour's smug certainty into legitimate resistance while reminding everyone of the terrible service being provided. In solidarity, the revolution continues. Ka pai Aotearoa.
The Bradbury Group, New Zealand's best weekly political argument. The Bradbury Group is an independent podcast through the Rover Network, sponsored by Wātea News. Everything on the show is an opinion and shouldn't be taken seriously enough to attempt defamation action against us. We were joking. We're never serious about anything. And officially, a small weta in Avondale is legally the owner. Good luck finding him. Don't forget to follow, like and comment.